evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape 411, side 1, October 19th, 1979. Last week I briefly mentioned the near-death, the shooting in Miami of Antonio Veciana. I didn't get space enough to put on the printed sheet that went with your tapes the date of the shooting. He was in a passing car, a car that went by him, fired at him. That article, as I mentioned before, was a 1-inch column in the New York Times on page 43. They did admit or say that he founded the Alpha 66, that notorious Anti-Castro Cuban exile group in the Miami area that then spread on to New Orleans in the Southwest and Texas, and they've worked in California, and even the Alpha 66 is here working with Fort Ord and out in Salinas. They're doing their training right now. Well, the 1-inch column on page 43 hardly gave much information. I want to give you 2 more references about him. Evidently, he survived this ambush. But the new House Select Committee on Assassinations has their final report out now. It's issued. And this is the summary, not the testimony. It's similar to the Warren report. It's the report that came out 13 years later on the assassination of John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King. But on page 160 and 161, and in the section 162 and 163, there's a discussion of Antonio Veciana Blanch, B-L-A-N-C-H, and it tells about his long association with the Central Intelligence Agency, and in fact he was part of an assassination team in Chile in 1971, and I've referred to those assassination teams that Jack Anderson briefly touched upon and the role they had in the Kennedy assassination, going back to that book, Treason for My Daily Bread, and Colonial Dignidad, the assassination centers down there in Chile. He was involved with an assassination attempt they were going to do on Fidel Castro in Chile in 71, but he does work with the Chilean assassination teams. The House Select Committee describes Veciano's testimony. He gave a lot of testimony, which I mentioned last week, on Lee Harvey Oswald, but the important thing was that he testified to the House Select Committee that he had been contacted by a CIA man who knew about his work in Mexico City, and they offered him a large sum of money if he would say that he and his wife had met Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City, and that if he wanted a relative to testify to that effect, and that he wasn't able to do so. But the important thing is that the Central Intelligence Agency wanted to set up Lee Harvey Oswald as a patsy, and they had a person impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico. And this man worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in Miami and in the New Orleans area in the CIA as a CIA agent, but they were setting up a trail of communist Oswald, so when the assassination came down they could blame the communists for killing John Kennedy, which in fact they did. Another reference to this person is in the Continuing Inquiry. That's the newsletter that Penn Jones gets out every month from Texas, from Midlothian, Texas. And this is a newspaper article about Mr. Veciano and the Anti-Castro Cubans and his work with Claire Luce and the doubles of Lee Harvey Oswald. This article is in Volume 3, Number 11 of Penn Jones' newsletter. And the person that they were talking about in this newsletter and in the final assassination report on the life of John Kennedy is the man that was shot at, and there was an attempted murder. And of course we know how many of the witnesses to the House Select Committee this year, the past year, and the Senator Church Committee, and of course before the Warren Commission, witnesses that were called to testify and witnesses that should have been called to testify were killed. So I imagine that he's gotten the message now and won't talk any more about Lee Harvey Oswald being in the CIA. There's a new book coming out about Elvis Presley, written by members of his family, and in this book, it's called Elvis, We Love You Tender. In the book, it says that Elvis first began to get his drug overdosing when he was in the Army in 1959, and the military men began to give him the amphetamines and narcotics that turned him into the drug addict that he became, and it eventually just killed him. The King of Rock was dead at an early age. And the important thing about Elvis in the year 1959 of getting at him and putting him in the army and sending him to Germany was that he was a threat. His sounds and his motions were a threat to the white WASP class, the military, the South where he lived, and they realized that his personality could be contagious and that he could become a leader. And the selected leaders, the people you can scream at and yell at, are like Frank Sinatra, who was always with members of organized crime. Elvis was independent, and the independent people in the system really don't make it. And the superstars are linked to organized crime or mafia. That's the way that Hollywood was taken over when it began as a legitimate place to make movies in the early days. The geniuses and the really great people were kicked out, and the thugs moved in, and that's why there's been such mediocre entertainment for so many years. Elvis had a good voice. The army was the place where he began to be drugged. Then he met his wife, future wife Priscilla, at that German base, American base in Germany, and she came back with him. Her father was in the military, and then when he returned, he was totally drugged. And even though he became very successful, they kept him at making the kind of movies he wanted to make and could make, and he died young. He was just drugged off and was assured an early death. Another singer who died just a few weeks ago was Jimmy McCulloch, 26 years old, who worked with Paul McCartney in the Wings, a group called the Wings. He was found dead in his London hotel room, and as of this date, there's been no account of how he died. But many of you know I keep track of the various musicians and what's happened to them as part of a pattern, because as an art form, jazz and then the rock music, the folk rock, became an art form that was able to mobilize people at a time when the young people were turning against the country, turning against the war, turning against the materialism of this country, and the whole goal was to get them back into purchasing and not dropping out of the system, but they become a part of it and not fracture out. And by lopping off the musicians who were political, it was effective to break the spirit of the movement as it was developing. Right now, there are some musicians who can draw large crowds in New York and so forth out here for anti-nuclear protests, but it was really mushrooming into a large thing in 1969 at the time of Woodstock, and that's why the government got into the Altamont concert with the Rolling Stones to break up that large mass movement of people who were out on the streets. It could be similar to the millions that followed Mahatma Gandhi as he led the British to the ocean, and they were kicked out. This counterculture never really had a chance to develop. I mentioned several weeks ago in September, I think it was the first week in September, the Tribal Stomp concert that was here in Monterey. The first American appearance there was a group called The Clash, described as the most political, anti-oppressive group representing the musical mainstream today. They're on the border of punk rock, but they're very, very political. And after the concert of The Clash, that was Saturday afternoon, I told you a woman that jumped off a bridge just about 1 block away from the music arena where the concert was over, just taking place. And at the concert, I told you people were handing out acid, asking us if they wanted to buy it, if you wanted to have it. And of course, the newspaper articles associated, again, the tribal stomp, the musicians, with death, because the death took place and this woman had jumped off, to show how crazy the young people are. They could be political on the stage, but look how crazy they are. Well, after the stories and all the splash was made about putting down again the musicians and the concert, or the attempt to get together, it turned out that the woman did not jump off the bridge because of acid, but now it turns out that a man held her over the bridge by her ankles and dropped her, and she was killed. The trial for that is going to take place here in Monterey County, and I'm going to go to that trial. I don't want to take time off from my writing, but once in a while I do go down to the courthouse and see what's going on here, and I want to see if I can pick up any evidence of mind control or zombie in the person that held her over the bridge and dropped her. I don't know if that'll come out in the trial, but the trial is going to take place here in Monterey County November 13th. So I think I'll attend that trial and see what I can pick up from this, because it was the same cause and effect that the media carried. You may not be getting it northwest around the country, but here it was very centralized. Have a concert, sing about the establishment, kill yourself. They're following the same kind of phenomena that took place in the past to associate the music with death. There's another new book coming out by Robert Slater. It's called The Murder of Marilyn Monroe. It should be out in 1980. I met Robert Slater when I was in Los Angeles at Terry Moore's place. He told me his experiences with Marilyn. He had been married to her shortly. And Robert is absolutely convinced that Marilyn Monroe was murdered. And there's a long article in the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Examiner on the reasons why she was murdered. But we'll go into them when the book comes out. There's a book on show business murders and a series of different people who have died, some murdered, some alleged suicides. But a few people now are getting in their heads the fact that a disproportionate number of people have died young, and they haven't made the connecting links of the politics of the era, because that's hard to do, and there aren't very many people I know who are capable of doing it or even see the world that way yet. There's a new book out called Those Who Died Young by Marion Sinclair, and I bought the book this week and began to check off which people out of the categories I had evidence or reason to believe were murdered, and there's about 40 people that they write about in this book. But among them, I marked off the ones that I felt had been murdered, and there was Marilyn Monroe, Montgomery Clift, James Dean, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, Jim Reeves, Otis Redding, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Duane Allman, Mama Cass, Graham Parsons, Mark Bolan, Keith Moon, Bruce Lee, Che Guevara, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Eva Peron, and Martin Luther King. Now that's an interesting combination. I did mention to some of you after I saw the play Evita and began to read more about Evita Peron's life, you understand why she died at age 33. And all of these people had the common enemy. They had something in common, was an untimely death, a suspicious death under strange circumstances, meeting with people who were similar in their hatred of them, and the goals for murdering these people all fell into the same basket. And I keep promising that tape, or 2 or 3 tapes, on the musicians. It will be coming. But there is this book now that does list all these musicians, and John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Che Guevara, and Martin Luther King, with the actors and musicians. And I think that's interesting. There's about 8 persons in the book that I don't even know. Paul Kossoff, Sam Cooke, Gene Vincent, Ed Cochran. I'd have to study their lives and see what there was about their lives and where they were politically at the time they died. But this is the first book that I've seen that has the political figures like Martin Luther King and the Kennedys and Che Guevara in with the actors and the musicians that I already have done some research on. I once asked Terry Moore when I was going over with her the story of her life in Hollywood. She was a starlet who met Howard Hughes when she was young and made movies and worked during the war overseas for the U.S.A. and for organizations. She was a cover girl on Life magazine, and still very attractive woman. And when she tells the story of her life, she would tell me about, well, I was friendly with this one, and she'd tell me stories about Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd. Then Mike Todd's airplane was in a plane crash. Or she was friendly with this one, and then she said, well, then he died very young. She was close. Jimmy Dean was in the home when they were just like kids together, just when their careers were coming up. And then Dean died, and then she would tell me about another one, and that one died, and another one. And all of a sudden there were about 12 people around her, all budding careers, all died very young. And I said, well, this is a moving obituary, and the common denominator always was one constant factor through the whole thing that touched all of these people's lives. And that same person and organization was the common denominator behind John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and the other political assassinations in this country. So this book coming out at this time is an interesting book, and you should read it. Another article making some connections, not saying the reasons why, but beginning to add them up, is an article that was in the Washington Post on airplane accidents, September the 23rd. The article's called Private Planes, the Heavy Toll, but it doesn't go into public planes such as United Airlines that had Dorothy Hunt, or the plane that went down over the Canary Islands and or plane with the riders at the Riders Convention that was going to Los Angeles, or the San Diego, the PSA plane that the Lieutenant Governor Merv Dimely was supposed to be on. Those were commercial planes. But this is an article on the heavy toll of private planes, and it lists politicians such as Representative Clem Miller from California, Hale Boggs, Jerry Pattis, Representative Jerry Pattis, Representative Jerry Litton from Missouri, Richard Obershane from Virginia, the nominee that lost when his plane crashed. John Warner went into the Senate. A fellow recently surfaced who said that he was responsible for the airplane crash of one of these members of the House, Representative Jerry Litton. How many of these were set up? Then there's athletics, and there's a list of athletes who were in questionable crashes, and one of them that wasn't on the list that I felt was a political murder was Roberto Clemente, the Puerto Rican who was going over to help the earthquake victims in Nicaragua. And it has a list of athletics. Then the entertainment, Will Rogers and Wiley Post. Well, I didn't know until I began to delve into the Howard Hughes story that Howard Hughes was competing with Wiley Post for the world's records in flying. And Will Rogers was making fun of the politicians. And they have Mike Todd on the list, and Buddy Holly, and Otis Redding, and Jim Reeves. Some of them are in that book. And Audie Murphy, and that's another common denominator. That was one of those persons that fell into that category of those 12 dead that Terry and I talked about. And it has the rock group The Chase, and Leonard Skinner. Of course, that was very political group. And Jim Croce wasn't on that list, but that's one of that I have on the list. I have many entertainment people. But then this article has political people like Mr. and Mrs. George Skakel, the parents of Ethel Kennedy, Mrs. Angier Biddle Duke, the wife of the diplomat in New York. Carol Tyler is listed under others, and it says secretary to former Lyndon Johnson aide Bobby Baker, who died in Ocean City, Maryland in 1965, but she was also the roommate of Mary Jo Kopechne, who later was to die after that cookout with Ted Kennedy and the various political aides at Chappaquiddick. They list George Skakel Jr., the brother of Ethel Kennedy, Walter Reuther, who died in a plane crash, but then they don't go into Yablonsky, whose family was purposely blown up, and Tony Boyle, the head of the United Mine Workers, was again convicted, had another trial, and was convicted last week for that conspiracy. And of course the sudden death out here in Carmel of Saul Alinsky 3 months after a very political article in Playboy, which I want to do with you on a tape. And Natalie Sinatra in 1977. The Sinatra family was used before the kidnapping of his son as a diversionary from the Kennedy assassination. That's a long, complicated story, but they have other plane crashes. Mrs. Ted Stevens, the wife of the senator in Alaska, Alexander Guterma, the financier from New York. And at the height of Watergate hearings, the Senate investigating Watergate, most of the men on the Senate, there was something, payoffs going. Senator Talmadge, that's when his pockets began to get filled with those dollar bills, and there's Mr. Guernsey down in Florida, and then they linked Montoya, who died later, to organized crime out in the Southwest. There was something on everybody except Lowell Weicker, and I believe it was at the time of those hearings. The Lowell Weicker sister, brother, I'd have to look it up, was killed in a plane crash with nieces and nephews, families of political figures. So this article on the toll of private plane crashes breaks into politics, athletics, entertainment, and others, and almost everyone on that list has a political reason or a political common denominator with their early demise also. The controversy going on in Memphis, Tennessee about the cause of death of Elvis Presley, and his autopsy papers have been taken to a vault, and they've been locked in a bank vault so they can't be stolen or destroyed, and there's a trial going on. ABC has asked for them, the TV station, because, as I mentioned once before on a tape, the Tennessee Shelby County medical examiner, Jerry Francisco, said that Elvis Presley died of a heart attack, and there's a lawsuit saying that he was deliberately drugged, that he was given drugs. Now that Tennessee area is a controversial one. We talked about Francisco being the one responsible for the autopsy on Martin Luther King, and they're not looking for another gunman coming from another direction where the bullets the one single bullet could have felled Martin Luther King. But last week there was more, several weeks ago rather, there was more controversy with Dr. Francisco, and there was a murder of a young person, 9-year-old person, who was murdered in Nashville, and they're asking to now exhume that body on the basis of the qualifications of Dr. Francisco and his opinion on the murder of this particular little girl. Also, the prison officials there are under investigation. They had a man hired who was supposed to be a doctor and wasn't a doctor at all, working in Memphis, Tennessee, and working, I guess, with Dr. Francisco. He went by the name of George Allen, and he was in the prison in Nashville for 13 months. He worked under the State Department of Corrections and posed as a physician. He got $36,000 a year, and he was the chief medical examiner at the prison. So the so-called George Allen, this doctor, was working at this prison and was no medical doctor in any way, shape, or form. And it was at the prison in St. Louis, Missouri, where the doctor, according to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, was involved in drugs and drug dealings with James Earl Ray, and Ray managed, in quotes, to escape, but he had assistance in escaping, and it had something to do with a doctor and drugs. So here in Nashville, Tennessee, where Ray once did, in fact, escape, and I did some tapes on that phony escape, and he was only brought back because of the clamor. You have a man as the chief medical examiner. He went by an alias of Dr. Jesse Fairchild Adams, and he had been impersonating a particular doctor, Dr. Adams, who was a Navy surgeon living in the state of Washington, and he was hired August 7th, 1978, during the administration of former Governor Ray Blanton. Ray Blanton was so irresponsible that he was charged with selling prison clemency during his administration. People could get out of prison by buying off the governor and his aides. Incidentally, all those charges are dropped. 4 men charged with selling prison clemency in Nashville, Tennessee. Just recently, those charges were dropped. But here's this man, George E. Allen, who was posing as a doctor, working in this particular prison, and took the name of other people and had to be working as the chief medical examiner of the prison in Nashville, Tennessee. He would be working with Dr. Francisco and the governor of the state, and all of them are corrupt, and they're involved in the Elvis Presley killing and the cover-up. They're involved in the Martin Luther King killing cover-up. I shouldn't say in the killing, but they're certainly involved in the cover-up, and they're involved with letting people out of prison who belong in, and also with letting a man in there pose as a doctor who even wasn't a doctor at all. Many of you know that I'm particularly interested in the subject of doubles, the phenomena of duplicating and impersonating one person in order for another to be the patsy or the fall guy, or for a particular individual to escape. There's a new book out. You may have seen the author. His name is Hugh Thomas. He's been on television and shows recently, talk shows. He's written a book called The Murder of Rudolf Hess, and he claims that the man in Spandau prison really isn't Hess at all, and that there's been a double there all along. I think the psychological reason of keeping one man in prison was to let people think that justice was served after World War II, and also to make the Russians feel secure that the Allies had kept in prison a man who had helped go to England to try to mobilize them to work with Germany against the Soviet Union. The book is called The Murder of Hess. This man claims that actually Hess was shot down by Adolf Hitler in an airplane, but they duplicated another person and let him serve the time in prison, that he's been an imposter since 1941, that he is masqueraded, that Hitler didn't say that he killed Hess, but they've had this imposter. And that this particular doctor had gone into the prison and was suspicious because there were no chest wounds in Hess, where there were wounds in his chest and lungs before. And he didn't see his wife for 28 years when he was in prison. He didn't want to see his wife, and when she went to see him, she thought he was changed, but she thought it was the prison years that did it. Another impersonation that took place is 3 ways you can impersonate. You can physically appear like the person, you can simulate their voice, and you can forge handwriting that looks like them. in the case of the voices, even Winston Churchill had a double, and a man, it just came forward, his name is Mr. Shelley, and he said that Norman Shelley, that he impersonated Winston Churchill's voice, that he authentically uttered words by him in the House of Commons during the war, and he helped give the British the energy to go on to fight the Germans, that the House of Commons was not recording or broadcasting directly from their place, but that he was the voice of Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and that he did in fact give a famous speech of Winston Churchill's that was very important to the future winning of the war by Great Britain and the United States. I've said all along that the Howard Hughes voice that was given in 1972 was an impersonation, that Hughes had died in 1971, and that they kept his empire going up through 1976, the spring of 76, in order to further the tentacles of the satellite space station Lockheed, Summa Corporation, the Medical Institute, keep it going as long as they could before they had to cash in the body of the double. So this man, at a time when Great Britain was in war, was the actual voice of Winston Churchill for a famous speech, not all the time, but for a very important famous speech, and we don't know how many. Going to 1977, that was in August of 77, and in October, tapes 282, 283, and 287, I talked about David Berkowitz with the code name Son of Sam. I've updated it from time to time on other tapes, and last week I talked about the death of Michael Carr. The Sam Carr was the man who lived below David Berkowitz, and I believe that that family was involved in those murders in New York City, and John Carr was killed at an army base. They called it suicide, but with no notice. That was last year, and then last week the other son of Sam Carr died in a car crash. I have that on tape 410 for those of you who don't have last week's tape. But since last week, there was a front page story, or almost front page, I take it back, page 8, of the Monterey Peninsula Herald, and also in the San Jose Mercury. I didn't see it in any other papers, and I haven't seen it in my New York Times or Washington Post, saying son of Sam accomplice being investigated. When one son of Sam Carr died, Michael Carr, then they came out and admitted a week later that they're investigating the death of his other son, and the Associated Press story this last week said the police in North Dakota say they are investigating the possibility that the man who committed suicide last year at Minot Air Force Base may have helped David Berkowitz commit the murders. The focus is apparent but suspicious suicide of John Carr, a son of Sam Carr, and a friend of David Berkowitz. Sam Carr was the man to whom Berkowitz referred when he adopted the name Son of Sam during his year-long spree of murder rampage in New York City. I'm reading this from our newspaper out here. The authorities are investigating the connection between David Berkowitz and John Carr since the alleged suicide in 1978. If he was involved in the Son of Sam killings, there would be a reason why he would commit suicide. Now that's the Associated Press. They don't say if he was involved, he is being killed, so the evidence won't come out. That's like William Sullivan being killed, or George DeMarnshield at the time of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and all these other witnesses. Certainly these courts and these killings of witnesses is identical to Nazi Germany. We could go over them over and over every week. But this article says, new Son of Sam death probe. The UPI said that John Carr fit the description that the witnesses gave of the killer who was responsible for some of the slayings. The Associated Press story out here says that Berkowitz and John Carr were friends and knew each other. The United Press story says that John Carr gives the appearance of the killers that was described. That's why you have to take 8 or 10 papers a day, because one paper says one thing and one says the other, and all of a sudden we find out that the descriptions of the person who did some of the killings was identical to John Carr, the son of Sam Carr, who was indeed the son of Sam, and Berkowitz said he was under his control all along. On the other side, we'll go into some other subjects pertinent to the news, but I think that's terribly important because I have done tapes on this, and I'm always happy when I'm not happy about it, but when information comes in about Elvis starting to be drugged on the Army base, or that John Carr and David Berkowitz knew each other, I know that I'm closer to the truth every single day. This is side 2 of tape 411, October the 19th, 1979, and it's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. The Vatican played a very big role in Europe and in the United States at the time of the Spanish Civil War, starting in 1936, where Adolf Hitler and Mussolini were testing their muscles. And one reason they did is that there are so many Catholics in the United States that would have maybe objected to that kind of a war going on over there, or what was happening, or Catholics around the world. And one of the first things that Hitler and Mussolini did was to make a pact and give a large amount of money to the Vatican after World War I, as a matter of fact, to stay, in quotes, neutral as they armed for World War II. And I'm going to keep updating our Pope because I believe he's the most political Pope that has ever been used, because he's the media Pope, the Polish Pope with the media and the actor training. So always when he stands against the blue sky with the white coats waving, or he has his little red pointy patent leather shoes and he gets down and kisses the ground and lifts the babies in the air and so forth, always remember he's the media Pope and watch what he does. So I want to update some stories on the Vatican for the tape as often as they come along, just as I update the murders, to watch the role of the use of the combined Christian religion to wipe out a good section of mankind and starve them out and kill them. Last week, of course, is Michel Sindona, that I made tapes about, appeared. He appeared because the Pope had gone home. Everything that has happened to him is a secret. The FBI and the New York detectives are not allowed to say where he was. The warrant for his arrest when he left town is sealed. It remains sealed as of the time that I'm making this tape. And the banking advisor to the Vatican has now reappeared. The Pope came home and obviously settled matters, because his chief of protocol, as I mentioned before, his bodyguard, his head banker, and the advance man, all in one, came to this country, and after that Sindona surfaced. He's been out on $3 million bond, and he's wanted in this country and in Europe for taking millions and millions of dollars. He was one of the wealthiest men in Italy, and illegally moved $225 million from a bank in Milan that he controlled, and had at least $40 million, they say up to $80 million of the Vatican money that he was dealing that is gone. Now it's funny, the Vatican can own the $2 billion worth of property around the world entirely, own the Watergate Hotel and buildings on the Champs-Elysees and real estate all over the world. And the Pope came to America, and there are just a few articles out of the many that were published. One in the Washington Post, The Parable of the Rich Man, a solemn rebuke to the selfish, and then a big, it's by Hens Johnson, a big square that says, when he speaks critically of the rich and permissive society, there's no doubt that he's speaking of America, the center of the capitalist world and the consumer society. It was his $90 million that came into American corporations and bought American stock and put money into Chase Manhattan and into Standard Oil and Mobil and all these various corporations. And he gets up on a pulpit that we'll talk about and talks about materialism. Another article, Harlem Catholics hail the Pope's admonition to the rich. Now get out Mein Kampf. If you don't own it, buy a paperback, go to the library and write what Adolf Hitler said about the rich and the poor. Adolf Hitler was put in by Standard Oil and DuPont and Henry Ford and American and British corporations and chemical corporations, and his speeches were against Wall Street, against the rich, help the poor, help the women and children, again, all those little children that the Pope is kissing. And he goes to Harlem, here the bank that Sindona was associated with was a bank that has been uncovered to be with organized crime and narcotics dealing. The narcotics ends up in Harlem. What keeps them poor is the drugs that they're on, and drug money goes through the banks that the Vatican has investment in. So dig that circle and understand when he goes to Harlem, he's just looking at the doped out people that the drug money has sent. And you didn't hear him give any speech against organized crime or stealing or his being ripped off in America of 40 or 90 million dollars that could go to the poor. Time magazine, loose publication, John Paul Superstar. That's just what he is, a special album of his journey. Like Jesus Christ the Superstar, they want to make a comparison because of that famous play and musical, Jesus Christ Superstar. John Paul is no Jesus Christ. If he were, he'd take off all those trimmings that he's got and all the millions. Jesus would never spend a cent on this kind of attire or this superficiality. They all take what Jesus had and did and can't live like Jesus lived for one day. And because they lived that day, they strung him up and made a lesson for everybody else who tried to live like him and poked his belly with a sword, and then began to accumulate the riches and the gold and to steal the prayers from the Jewish Psalms of David that are read in every Christian church, and the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, the story of creation, and the various prayers that were taken by the Christian church based upon Jewish prayers, a Jewish boy named Jesus that they strung up, and then he goes around, John Paul Superstar. Another big article in the New York Times, Pope John Paul, with you we will, by the grace of God, restore morality. Where is morality? Embracing a mission of global moral authority. That's just some of the rip-off. If you read the papers, you know the crap that was coming out. If you don't get the Eastern papers, go to the library and puke. Another article, editorial by Richard Eder. The Pope is a humanist. From unusual background, John Paul acquired the intellectual tools with which to hold his own. Now that's true. With his background, he did develop the tools to hold his own. The question is, can you hold your own against him? Another article, 6 cities visited by the Pope estimate they spent $7 million. Not counting the cost of what the Catholic Church spent, New York City spent $3 million. If he was loved so much, you didn't need that many police, or, there were bodyguards around to keep people from killing him, actually, but there isn't much about that. In Philadelphia, they built a platform that cost $75,000. Was led by Mayor Frank L. Rizzo, 26 feet high, 144 feet across. Why didn't he just go to a Catholic church and say prayers on the soil of America? $75,000 for that, and the Civil Liberties has a lawsuit against the altar that cost $196,000, and that was just for the material. That wasn't for the building. In Chicago, where they're broke, and Mayor Jane Byrne, is trying to cut the budget from all kinds of activities, they spent over $1 million, $1.5 million for the Pope in Washington, D.C. In Boston, it was between $450,000. And these pulpits, the altar in Washington, D.C., the altar alone and the backdrop was $400,000. Now, if he isn't a media pope, what do you need a backdrop that costs $400,000? I mean, I could have given them one of my sheets if they want that you get at a garage sale for 50 cents. I don't know why, and certainly Jesus Christ Superstar didn't have a $400,000 altar. Chicago spent $600,000 just to get out mass books to say with the Pope. And then he admonishes the materialism and sits on a stool over there at Madison Square Garden and grunts. If you heard the youthful people singing to him, and he is, should I imitate him, going, every grunt's $1. That's what it was on television if you saw him. Another article in the Washington Post, not an article, a letter to the editor, September 30th, 1979, time for the Vatican to recognize Israel. It says, how far can they go? It's about the moral imperative of recognizing the state of Israel, the establishment of diplomatic relations with the Jewish state, that the Jewish state has been there since 1948, and as Rabbi Rosenzweig writes that Israel is backed in, the third world is ganging up against them, that they've been a bulwark there, and there's now this pressures of oil politics and communist ideologies, and Israel's being squeezed out, and the Vatican has never represented or recognized that Israel is a country yet, and will not establish foreign diplomatic relations between the Vatican and the Jewish state because it denies the existence of the Jewish state. Another series of articles about Polish spies now, this I.G. FARBEN, Polish Pope, and we'll go into that in a little bit, is now being embroiled in stories of Polish spies. He has so much visibility going in and out of Poland, and then this money that's for the church can be used to foment the revolution, like the Hungarian Revolution against the communists, to break loose from the communists. One article this last week from the Los Angeles Times, Poland is delaying the passport for a journalist that a priest invited by the Pope. The Pope asked a journalist from Radio Free Europe with headquarters in Munich, Germany, to go on his personal plane, while he took this trip around the United States. And Poland claims that that priest belongs to the Central Intelligence Agency, and that the presence of the correspondent of Radio Free Europe on this Pope's trip was offensive to them, and they interpreted it as being American-sponsored with links to the intelligence community. Now they're holding up the passport of another priest journalist who was invited to travel with the Pope and the staff of the Vatican, Adam Boniecki, Reverend Adam Boniecki, and they're claiming that America betrayed them, and the Pope did by taking a man from Munich, Germany, who'd been doing propaganda against the government for years on Radio Free Europe. Another woman, a Polish aide from the United Nations, who wasn't sent by the government of Poland, who's been linked from a foreign country, has been arrested. She was traveling through Poland, and she's been arrested as being a danger to the security of Poland. And she was working in the United States and getting her Ph.D. She was a student. She went through Poland to see her parents, and they kept her there. And the United Nations is claiming that you can't hold somebody back when they're traveling through like that. And Poland is saying when you have a spy, the United Nations conditions for somebody traveling through are different, and they're holding this woman there. Another article about the FBI working with the Polish government in 1972, and that's the time when those priests in Philadelphia were in trouble and went to Poland when Carol was still over there and wasn't the Pope, went with their problems of financial embezzlement and so forth. They were beginning to cipher $22 million out of the Philadelphia area. In 1972, just at that time, the FBI was working with Polish agents, and in order to get certain Polish citizens to the United States, the FBI turned over detailed information about 8 lawyers in Chicago area in order to blackmail them, to blackmail the Polish officials to release people who later could be part of the Cold War against Poland. And they turned over, the FBI turned information about these attorneys' secretaries and their mistresses, and the girlfriends, where they take vacations, their drinking habits, their family members. And all of this, they were wiretapped, their lines were wiretapped, these attorneys. One of them, just as a fluke, sent to the Freedom of Information for some facts about himself. His name is Melvin Stein of Chicago, and then found out that the FBI had all this information in Poland, and he is suing William Webster, the director of the FBI, and the former Attorney General Griffin Bell, because they still have locked up these documents and won't release them. And they have them in vaults in the Dirksen Federal Building, the information about these lawyers. But in order to get these people over here from Poland, and they weren't allowed on a legitimate basis, they got these lawyers blackmailed, and that is the name of the game, I always say, in this country. Bullets and blackmail will get them what they want, and that's what they use. There's an article in the L.A. Times last week about Cardinal Cody, a man of controversy in Chicago, and of course this Pope had to make amends in all those cities as he traveled. Cardinal Cody was in charge of parochial schools in the Chicago area and decided to close schools that catered to the blacks. Some of them are non-Catholic, middle-class blacks who wanted to go to private schools. There are private schools in our area that are Catholic schools that non-Catholics can attend. But he closed the ones where the blacks were going, and he's been very controversial, and they've been trying to get him out of that Chicago area. It's been impossible for the other popes to do it, and now there's a suggestion that he may be transferred to a Vatican post. But you can see why this guy had to cover some of these bases with these $90 million and controversies going on in these various cities. that Paul Marcinkus, the bodyguard, advance man, and head of the Vatican money, the bag man that travels next to the Pope, is from Chicago, Illinois, and that's his home base. And I mentioned before that LA Times article that Vatican watchers predicted Marcinkus would be eased out when after the Sedona scandal, because he was linked to the bankruptcy and the Vatican money up to $80 million, this article said. The various articles go from 45 to 90 million of Vatican money that's missing. And the LA Times article said that after Pope Paul VI, the death, they thought that this Chicagoan would disappear from the papal sanctum, the inner sanctum. But when John Paul II came in, he was more thoroughly entrenched than ever. In Vatican City last week, Pope Paul II, for all of his greasy speaking, do I say I'm angry at him? I guess I am. I'm angry at the media hype and the murder of John Paul I and all that's taking place. An article that a very liberal cardinal offered his resignation, which they have to do at age 75, but John Paul II has been taking back men older than 75 years old. It's a formality, like when members of our cabinet turn in their resignations at the change of administrations. At age 75, they turn it in. And the Belgian cardinal, Swinen, his name is Leo Joseph Swinen, turned in his resignation, and John Paul II accepted it. This was the most liberal member of the Vatican, and he was the one who would want to change the Curia, which is the centralization of power in Italy, in the Vatican. And Pope John Paul II, speaking of materialism and America giving up their money and all that, as I say, the media hype, when the most liberal member of the Vatican turned in automatically his resignation, John Paul II jumped on it. There's another article about the Vatican's second in command, Cardinal Casseroli. That was in last week's Washington Post. Some people are eking out a little bit of truth. This is by Megan Rosenfeld, and this article says, when John Paul II visited the White House with the entourage, the second most important man was his Secretary of State from the Vatican, Agostino Casseroli. It goes on to say that he's a skilled diplomat with the Vatican hierarchy. He's steady and he's methodical, and it tells how he skillfully worked his way up to becoming the Secretary of the Vatican, and his relationships began with Reverend Carl Wojtyla, that's the current Pope, in his elevation to Cardinal in 1967. It's when this particular person, Casseroli, took note of Carol. He went to Poland in 1967, and when he saw Carol Wojtyla, the next year he negotiated with the government there, and that's when Carol Wojtyla moved up in his career in 1967. Now, the second man of the Vatican, this Casseroli, was born in Milan in 1914. There is a group around Pope Paul VI, who was Secretary of the Vatican, writing those passports for the Nazis, called the Milan Mafia. When he became the Pope, and I've done this on other tapes, he brought back to Italy what they called the Milan Mafia. The second in command to the Vatican is a member of that Milan Mafia, born in Milan, ordained in 1937, who did go to Poland and visited Pope Carol Wojtyla and elevated him to cardinal the year after the visit in Poland. This man was planned for a long, long time, this Pope John Paul II. Another article from a magazine called Ligurian on the rise of John Paul II, and it's about a man who went to Italy, studied with him. He's one of the 5 Americans from St. Petersburg, Florida, who went to visit when he was ordained the Pope, who went to school with him and is active in the Vatican politics with the Pope. I also did a mention a few weeks ago about the lawyer from the Florida area. His law office was used to write illegal passports and aliases for people, and he was Jimmy Carter's ambassador there in the Vatican until he was brought home because of that other scandal. This Father Larkin from Florida said he met Father Carol Wojtyla in 1948. 1945, when the war was over, in 1947, the National Security Council was formed, and the Central Intelligence Agency. In 1948 was a very important year, and that's when Larkin met Wojtyla, and they were graduate students at the university in Rome. And then Wojtyla went on to be from a bishop to a cardinal in 9 years. This article says he rose through the ranks from bishop to cardinal in a very fast pace from 1958 to 1967. And in 1967 is when that member of the Vatican entourage, who was a diplomat who worked his way up through the ranks, another article on how he promoted himself to the ranks, he went to Poland and picked this man. I think it's interesting that Joan Baez, who recently has been accused of being in the CIA, posters of her working with the CIA, she's doing good work in helping those refugees, and I think it's great. And she's going to Rome to speak to the Pope about those particular refugees, that are the deaths that are taking place in Indochina and Cambodia. But she feels that if she goes right from Southeast Asia to see the Pope, that he will help her. I think it's great that she's doing that. I also think it would be nice if she took care of what's happening to the same poor people that are being tortured and starved off in Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, took note of Jonestown and Guyana, Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. There are many deaths happening and many tortures taking place in all Catholic countries. These are all Catholic. Indonesia and Cambodia isn't all Catholic, under the domain of the Pope. But where they're almost 90% Catholic population is where these murders and assassination teams and Nazis are harbored. And I would always have liked to see Joan Baez take the issue to the Pope about those situations, and I've taken issue with her many times in the past years. One of my subscribers to the tapes sent me a book that came out after the visit of the Pope, Pope John Paul II, and also sent me a button. I asked them to send me a button. I have a button collection, and I got a button from the Pope in New York City. If any of you pick up other buttons or see political buttons in your hometown for various movements and so forth, I do have a vast button collection. But I got this book last week on Pope John Paul II, and I just want to mention a few pages in it. You can buy it or get it at the library. But from page 47 to 59, it goes into the background of this particular Pope in the rock quarry at Solvay plant, and that's the plant that I said was Auschwitz, owned by I.G. FARBEN. And those of you who don't have the background on the Pope will have to get my back tapes on it. The book tells about in 1940 how Carl Watola, I don't know if I pronounced his name right, worked in the underground theater, Rhapsody Theater, as an actor, co-producer. Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, and there was very little theater of any kind, and what he calls the Rhapsody Theater, the underground group, could as much been an underground with the German side as against the Russians in this war, because many of the Poles, in fact most of them, went welcomely. Germany was welcomed as soon as they entered. There was no problem with the Germans taking over Poland. The book says he played many roles in the productions during the Nazi occupation, and it talks about conspiratorial classes and clandestine theater performances, but that could be used by the Nazis against the Russians later, which he's doing now. And it tells about a superficial listing of helping Jews, but all the Jews were wiped out there except a handful, and I don't know that his name was legend among the Jewish community. The important thing was that he was interested in theater, cinema, and sports. And then it goes on to say that his work at the rock quarry at Solvay plant, where he was sent to work each day, made him see the Jewish plight, and it might have been a determining factor in his becoming a priest. And it tells how he was working at the rock quarry at Solvay Chemical Company. Now, Solvay comes into this book, and they refer to it on several pages. On page 41, it says, during the war, he went to work. It tells about the Gestapo, as I say, coming in, and then he went to work in a rock quarry. He found a job at the Solvay Chemical Works near Krakow. He secured this job at Solvay, and they needed stones as raw material. And without much time, he got to know the foreman, and he was promoted. He didn't do the rock work much, but he was a shot firer, and they used explosives and bore into the rock and strung up fuses in those caves and mines, hid airplanes and material of the Nazis during the war. It tells about his early promotion and that he stayed in a heated hut with bosses while other men were out there in the rock quarry, and the job in the quarry was over in the daytime. In the evenings, he was studying in secret. On page 44, it tells about the Solvay factory, and that he did again, new job is to purify boiler water, and he carried buckets of water and so forth. The book says, while working in Solvay, he became actively involved in efforts to improve the working conditions in the factory and to provide for workers' religious and cultural needs, as well as creating recreational facilities for them in the rock quarry. Well, Auschwitz had its string quartets, its cultural facilities, and religious facilities for Christians, not for all religions, and he was working under the Nazis. When you get to a book called Treason's Peace, and I think I've had that on a book list for you before, it's about German dyes and American dupes by Mr. Armbruster. On page 340 and 347, it talks about I.G. Farben, and they were named as co-conspirators with Solvay Process, owned by Allied Chemical and Dye Company, its Belgian name Solvay and AC, and the German-owned American Potash and Chemical Company. Pope John Paul II worked in Poland for Solvay Company that was also Allied Chemical and Dye Company that was linked to I.G. Farben. And as a matter of fact, when they were charged with conspiracy, when Farben was charged with conspiracy after the war, in various legal matters, their advisor was John Foster Dulles of the firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, and Allen Dulles, who was the head of the OSS and the CIA, was the brother John Foster Dulles, and this Dulles was a director and a partner to the company of I.G. Farben. And that's who this book wrote about the law case where Mr. Dulles interceded for I.G. Farben in the Justice Department, one of his companies. And it says it's rather possible that someone inside the government may have believed it was poor taste publicly to hold up to scorn a company like I.G. Farben, of which Mr. Dulles was a director of I.G. Farben and also a partner. And I.G. Farben and Solvay Chemical and Allied Chemical were partners. But you don't get that in one book. You get in two or three. First we start with the Pope working at Solvay, the book Treason's Peace, the link of the Dulles brothers to Solvay and I.G. Farben. Then another book, I.G. Farben, Questions and Answers, that was written, this book was written in 1947. And I think I've given you, again, I'll give the bibliography on this. It's about Hitler and big business and the army, and it goes into I.G. Farben and page 129 about Hermann Goering work. The head of I.G. Farben and Goering work took over, seized the Belgium company, the Solvay company, and I.G. then cooperated with that Goering Works company, made a complete control of the Belgian Solvay Chemical Company. So what you have is I.G. Farben up to a certain year in 1932 being separate, then taking over the Solvay Chemical Company that this Pope worked for when he was studying acting and drama. So out of a series of 3 books, you get part of the story. Another good book by Anthony Sutton, The Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. There's a whole chapter on the empire of I.G. Farben and how it built up, and that was the company that made the gas that exterminated the people in all the concentration camps that were located in Poland, and the use of Paul Warburg, the Bank of Manhattan, and Henry Ford, a Ford Motor Company, and so forth, being behind I.G. Farben. So also this book on the empire of I.G. Farben goes into Prince Bernhard. I think a long time ago when the Pope first came in, we talked about the politics of this. One of the most prominent of the Farben intelligence workers was Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who joined Farben in the early 1930s after the completion of 18 months with Hitler's black uniformed SS, the Gestapo. It's Mr. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands who forms the Bilderberger. He formed that secret society. Brzezinski is the daddy or the organizer of the international arm and represents this group, and that's how they selected this Polish Pope, through the Bilderbergers, the Council of Foreign Relations, and particularly that Bernhard group that really runs our State Department through men like Kissinger and Bernhard. They had knowledge of this Pope from the days he was promoted from knocking a few rocks to setting up the culture and religious services over in this company. And if he was in fact considered of a handful of Jews that lived in Poland after the war, the 600 Jews or so, which this book says that he had some sympathy for the Jews and worked in the underground, why can't this Pope then recognize Israel as a homeland for those Jews that he saw killed? Because his country in Poland was the home base for all of the concentration camps that came out of Poland. And this man is in his politics between the Catholic Church in Chicago and their corruption and racism, the Catholic Church in Philadelphia and their rip-offs, the Catholic Church in Washington with its Watergate bugging and breaking a president, to get a succession of people that could finally pick a Polish Pope, the one they wanted. They got Nixon, Agnew out, and Rockefeller killed, and they can successfully handpick through blackmail and murder any president that doesn't go along. And Jimmy Carter certainly has been the president that welcomed the Polish Pope after the one was killed. Before he came to this country, his wife Rosalind and Amy were photographed in the Vatican, and this religious, devoutly Christian man welcomes the Polish Pope to try to make the entire world Christian, which is what Jimmy Carter wants also. For some of you, this goes too fast because you're not filled in on the back details. I keep apologizing for that, but I just have to keep it at this speed. Our time is out. I'll be with you next week. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel, and you take care.